interesting is like when people put themselves in a position like where they almost kind of have to give it a shot. So what happened was my mom. I still don't know how exactly it happened. I must have just raved about the show, and so I'd gotten my mom into 24. She loved 24, and then
I just gotta interject and say that show fucking sucks. Sorry.
Yeah, it has its moments in its heyday.
Sorry. It was like I watched the first 3 or 4 episodes, and it was like a fucking horrible after-school special about the perils of drug use.
wait, which
Mixed in with well, it was like
which
the
season?
dude, the kid,
Which
the dude's
season?
daughter. I think it was the very first season. The dude's daughter is partying with the wrong friends, and that's part of the morality tale. And not only, and then the next thing happens, they end up with some shady dudes, and it's not just that the dudes are supplying them with drugs. Then they abduct them, and then they take them all around town, and it was like almost Tromaville level of shit, you know, where they like then it looks like they're gonna escape, and then they get hit by a car, and one of them's got a broken leg, and I just couldn't believe the fucking melodrama. And then not to mention that you have like whatever he was, is he FBI? Like what is?
No, dude,
It
he's
was just
CTU, man.
CTU, man.
which was
Come
just like this
on.
ridiculous GI Joe version of the Bureau or something, and just the things happening. I just it was offensive to me. I thought it was one of the worst things I'd ever watched, and I started tuning out so much by like the second episode.
Okay,
that
hold
all
on,
I
hold on.
retained was the fucking daughters screaming in the back of the van, and then of course like where they end up pulling over the guys with the van with the daughters in it or something like that, and then not realizing it. And I was like, ugh.
Well, here's the thing. All right, so
It was fucking
I'm not going to dispute
sad.
anything you said there because that was true. However, first of all, to not acknowledge that, I mean, the ticking clock. It takes place in a day. Each episode is a day. Like you weren't
Yeah, but
tense. You weren't
so
wrung
what?
out
So many
by the end
things
of each
have
episode.
gimmicks like that. I mean, and whether or not it's a gimmick was up to the show's producers. And maybe they did do something with it eventually, but right at that point, I mean, I've read like, look, Jeff, you read Savage Dragon, totally hokey comic book that's just for fun, and the whole thing with that is that it was written in real time, so to speak, so that every 30 days that would pass between issues coming out, 30 days had passed in the book. And I mean, there's been plenty of people that have played with time like that, and I think really people were attracted to the shitty melodrama, and that was their thing to latch onto and tell people like, you know, yeah, this is edifying experimental programming here.
Well, to
But it
me,
was
it was
really an
just
after
like
school special.
it was just popcorn to me. I mean, it was just it was bubble gum. It was good bubble gum. I didn't
Well,
take it as anything more than just some good melodrama.
No, but
Bubblegum.
the other thing I liked about the show was, especially for the first 3 seasons, for as long as President Palmer was on it, was, I mean, you had this thing like where, you know, Jack Bauer, played by Kiefer Sutherland, gets pulled into this conspiracy that's sort of reminiscent of the Parallax View and, you know, these other conspiracy movies from the 70s, like where, you know, for the first, I think it goes about almost 8 episodes, like where they're forcing him to be in a position, they're forcing him to kill Senator Palmer, who is running for president. And I mean, to me, I felt like the powerful thing about the show was that you had Jack and his family, and you had Palmer and his family. You had this Lady Macbeth schemer, sort of Lady Macbeth crossed with Richard III in Sherry Palmer. But you had these two guys, these two men. You know, one guy who sort of works in the upper echelons in government. The other guy operates in the shadows. And as it goes on, after the first season, where now Palmer has become president, and so Jack, in a sense, well, Jack does work for him, and you know sometimes has to get orders to do some things that are troubling or risky or all those things. And you had, to me, it was just to show these men and their families and their lives against this melodramatic backdrop. I just found intriguing and riveting. I couldn't get away from it. And I feel like, in a weird way, I feel like for a number of people, I feel like 24 got people comfortable with the concept of Obama running for president. I really actually do.
Really? Oh,
I
because of
do.
President Palmer?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I just think that there was, I mean, the show wasn't political in the nature of the candidates. There were definitely politics in the show, and the creator of the show is fairly right wing. Definitely believes that torture works, which is funny because I feel like that. I feel like the same way about that show and its politics, the way or the way not the politics, the way the show's politics and the way the creator expressed his politics, like in this long New York article. The same way I feel about Spike Lee and the way he'll express his politics versus what actually turns up in the work. So what I mean by that is, this guy's like, hey, 9/11 happened, we got to get our hands dirty, torture's cool. And there were a number of people in the Bush administration who were big fans of the show. And, there is a theory that, to some way, probably small, it helped influence some of the thinking as it went on. But
dude, you're describing the most frightening prospect that I've heard in a long time.
Let me finish though. So in season 4, right, the show itself is actually much more nuanced and ambivalent about torture than what Cerno, the creator of the show, is expressing publicly. So for instance, like in season 4, basically Jack goes to work on a dude who's like the current husband, the estranged husband of this woman, the daughter of the Secretary of Defense that he's gotten with, and like dude didn't do anything. I mean, he turns out to be innocent. Then he'd used some experimental sensory deprivation stuff on her brother. I mean, the stuff that like you see in this show is much more. It's way more ambivalent. It's nothing like down like hard line like torture is good. And that's what was funny to me is that maybe it's just sort of the artist where he's like, look, I have to. For the sake of drama, for the sake of tension, I can't just sort of be like torture is good. I've got to show all these sides. I've got to show the complexity. I've got to show Jack doing things that sometimes he's right, sometimes he's wrong.
Okay, on that note, I got to interrupt though to say that our producer Zuda Granny just explained to me that one season Bauer cuts the head off a child molester in order to infiltrate a gang. So clearly, sometimes he's doing some right and sometimes he's doing some wrong. And sometimes he's doing some, I don't know, man.
Dude, that's not even the worst of it. At the end of, this was partway through season 3, he basically the person who has the town in this grip of terror and is basically saying, hey, they can't get to him, so they've got to do what he says. And he's like, look, you got to take out the guy from District, Chappelle. So basically the boss, the guy who oversees the division of CTU that Jack's been operating in. And they're trying like hell to get to this guy and they fail. And Jack's basically got to take him out to some abandoned graveyard and shoot this dude in the back of the head, which he does.
And this is why I like the show, because to me it was basically a comedy.
It sounds like it. I mean, is there a way to, like, if Garth Ennis was writing it, I can imagine, and it was illustrated by like Steve Dillon instead of being TV, I can imagine it maybe working because it's supposed to be just absurd, and it's wearing that on his sleeve. But I never heard anyone talk about the show in those terms. You have to see this insane comedy or this like fucking absurd show.
Well, to me, at the point where the president is the bad guy, that to me is where we were in like total comic book like fun.
Metal Gear.
I mean, because he's not just a bad guy. He's like, I mean, it was like a combination of, I don't know, like Richard Nixon and Dr. Evil or something. It was like. To me, I really, honestly, I'm not kidding. I was watching it almost like a comedy. It was like, what are they going to do this week that's like so more ridiculously over the top than last week? And if they could pull it off, I would be kind of like, bravo, that was funny.
Did you put it up there with Dr. Strangelove?
Hell no. Hell no. Now that's a masterpiece.
It's not Strangelovian, and it's one of those things that you kind of have to get in the rhythm. I mean, it definitely was melodramatic. It definitely was melodramatic, but that it had.
But you said this. You at least think. I don't know what evidence you presented, but you think that this horrible show might have influenced policy toward interrogation and handling of prisoners.
Well,
that's fucking insane.
Dude, he rolled with certain people in the administration, and there were definitely, sort of, there are points, as much as people say like Hollywood is just liberal, there are points at which, the administration had people who were interfacing with people in the entertainment community that had similar views, so I mean, I don't have all this stuff in front of me, unfortunately. Maybe I'll dig that up for a future episode. But I mean, at the very least, sort of they felt like this was a pop culture confirmation of the rightness of what they were doing.
I did one thing you said earlier is I find almost more interesting is the idea that it eased the country into the idea of Obama. Because I do remember when season one premiered, that I thought it was really interesting and really cool that the fact that President Palmer was black was never an issue at all. It never comes up once in the dialogue that, oh, and by the way, our president is black. He just happened to be the president. That was just the actor they got to do it. And I thought at that time, of all the aspects of the show, that was actually, to me, the most interesting and the boldest, that they didn't make that be any big deal whatsoever. And so that made me wonder if...
What year was the show set in, though? Was it in the present day?
It was in the present, yeah.
I mean, why was that bold, though, instead of missed opportunity, right? I mean...
Well,
what do you mean?
Because
missed
there's so
opportunity
much...
in terms of making it be an issue?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to do with it, and it seems that, like, the bold thing would be to take that head on, and the challenging thing, knowing how difficult it would be, as opposed to just pretending. Because it's kind of like, when people hold up like Lara Croft or something as a positive example of, female figures in gaming, but then when you look at them, I mean, I don't want to knock, the studio, because I haven't played a Tomb Raider game in so long, but at the time, when I first played them, it was like, same thing with comic books that happens, you're like, this isn't really doing anything to address the issue. It's just ignoring it by saying women are exactly the same as men. They just happen to have fake tits glued to their chest,
Right. It's just that in this case, the story they were telling didn't happen to be about race. I mean, it was about this one agent's, ordeal in this 24-hour time period. I mean, you're right.
And they didn't. So that makes sense. I mean, if the show, if it was beyond its scope as to how he was elected, and getting him elected was part of the situation, and then the details of his presidency, if those aren't happening in the scope of the show regardless, then yeah, that makes perfect sense then.
Right. He just happened to be the president.
Yeah, and I think there are a couple of things that it did, though, that were interesting. One is I felt like it was more signifying on some of those things. So, for instance, the whole thing with Jack being forced to be in a position to assassinate him, plays on the assassination of JFK, obviously, and these other, movies like Arlington Road and things like that, but also the assassination of prominent black leaders like Malcolm X or Martin Luther King. The other thing is, I think I think you're right, Sean, that it could have been a more challenging thing to do or more provocative thing to do, could have been to sort of tackle race head on. But I felt the flip side of it was especially in the character of Sherry Palmer, is, having a compelling character who was devious at some points, evil at some points, but mostly devious and mostly scheming because she felt like this is what she had to do in order to guarantee her husband's election. And to have it be a character that was she was able to be a character just like any other character would be in that situation. That it didn't have to be, look, sometimes the progressive thing to do is tackle race head on, and sometimes the progressive thing to do is just sort of say like, hey, we have some really talented actors and a really compelling storyline, and we're just going to let them be that character. Like, we're not going to make it about that, and that creates some interesting moments. Like, I don't know if you remember, Jeff, the scene from season 2, like where he basically, because he's not good, there's a tough call that he needs to make, and he's basically deliberating for more time. And I think it involves military action against a country that they're being set up to believe is taking military action on them. And so basically, people in his cabinet get together and they basically depose him.
Right.
And his longtime, I think, chief of staff, or maybe it was his campaign manager from the campaign trail, who's now part of the administration with him. He basically refers to him by his, is basically, he calls him by his first name. This is when he's been deposed and he's basically in a holding area at the presidential compound. And the guy, basically says, what was his name? Is it John Palmer? David Palmer. And the guy calls him David, and he says, I'm the president, Mike. You don't call me by my first name. And to this black viewer, that was a Mr. Tibbs moment. You know what I'm saying? That was straight up Mr. Tibbs, Sidney Poitier in the heat of the night moment. And they got to have that without him having to say something, more corny like, you racist cracker.
Right.
Anyway, I don't want to oversell the virtues. I don't think I've convinced Sean here about that one. Maybe Oz, but not that one. But 24 entertained the hell out of me for 4 or 5 seasons. And then I got bored.